Okay. Hello and welcome everybody who's watching now. This is Mr. Richardson, and you are watching this because we are prepping for tomorrow's lesson on psychology. Now you might be asking yourself, Mr. Richardson, why are we learning about psychology? This is an English class. That is a very good question, and we're going to learn about that. So the reason we are going to talk about psychology is because we are reading a book right now called Lord of the Flies, and that's a very psychological book. To understand Lord of the Flies fully, it really helps to understand some of the psychological concepts behind it. There's a lot going on in the minds of the boys on this island. And it's good to just read the book and understand it, but if you can understand some of the concepts that are going on behind the way they think while they're on the island, you're going to understand the book a little bit better. So that's the brief introduction of why we're going to be talking about psychology. You guys will get a lot more tomorrow, but I'd like you guys to be a little bit prepared for our discussion tomorrow because psychology is not a class that everybody has taken. Psychology involves some concepts that aren't familiar to everybody, and it will be helpful to go into class understanding a little bit of those concepts. So what we're going to focus on today is social psychology, which is a branch of psychology, just like biology is a branch of science. Social psychology steps away from regular psychology because it deals with individual people and groups. So I'm going to read you guys here the definition of social psychology. Social psychology is the scientific study of how the real, imagined, or implied presence of others influences our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So that's the definition of social psychology. Why does that matter for Lord of the Flies? Well, this is a group of boys stuck on an island. They cannot get away from each other, so you can bet that they are going to be affecting each other. So social psychology comes into play when we examine how each individual boy is affected by the group. Think a little bit about the reading you've done so far. We've learned about Simon, we've learned about Ralph and Jack and Piggy, and you should have noted by now that these boys are really being affected by each other. That's what social psychology is about. We're looking for those effects. Before we go any further, let's talk about the big aspects of social psychology because we're going to be talking about these tomorrow. And these big aspects, and I recommend if you have a pen and paper, write these down so you remember them. These big aspects, you can remember them as the ABCs, are A, affect, B, behavior, and C, cognition. So here's what those are. A for affect is how we feel about things. So for example, if somebody makes me mad, or if somebody makes me angry, or same thing, if somebody makes me tired, if somebody makes me happy, if something I do makes me bored, that's affect. B, behavior. Behavior is the things we actually do. So if I'm really, really mad at somebody and I throw a punch at him, that's behavior. Finally, we have cognition, and that's how we think about things. So if I think that somebody is mad at me, and so I act a different way towards them, we can think of that as cognition. So those are the big three aspects of social psychology. Most things that we study in social psychology are going to fall into one of those three categories. So those are very important to know. Another couple things that we look at in social psychology are simply why people act the way they do, and one of the biggest debates is why people act nice or why people act mean. That's a huge thing that we're going to see in Lord of the Flies. We're going to have boys who are acting nice and boys who are acting mean all the time. And it's really important to wonder why they're doing that. Wonder why they act nice to somebody and wonder why they act mean to somebody else. Another important thing is to understand the importance of what's going on in a situation. How is that situation affecting each individual? And finally, it's important to understand what everybody needs personally in their social, psychological head. Things like support, confidence, those kind of things are things that we need to have to feel safe, to feel sane, if that makes sense. So those are some of the important things that social psychology looks at. What we're going to be looking at specifically tomorrow is called social influence. Social influence is how the group affects an individual. And that is not something that happens very easily. It requires certain things to happen. We will see social impact. That's what we call this when somebody is affected by a group or a person. We will see social impact when certain things happen. And we're going to go into more of this tomorrow, but this is the last point I want to go over so that you guys have a rough understanding of what we're going to start with tomorrow. Something will affect somebody. So let's say I am standing there and I'm going to be affected by something, by somebody. Something will affect me strongly if a couple things are happening. Those things are strength, immediacy, number of sources, and number of targets. I know that sounds like gibberish now, but I'm going to explain it now, and we're going to talk a little bit about it tomorrow. So, I will be affected by something if the strength of the source is very strong. So think of it this way. If my boss, who's the principal, tells me that I have to stay late at school, do you think I'm going to do it? I probably will because he's my boss. And that demonstrates the strength of the source. He is a strong person because he's in charge of me. And he gets to tell me what to do. He gets to tell me to do what he wants because he is my boss and he is a strong source. And he affected me. So I'm going to stay after school now. That's what he affected me, and he was able to do it because he's my boss. The second thing is the immediacy of a source. The immediacy of the source is how close the source is to you. And that can be physically or it can be emotionally. So if the principal comes up to me and he says, Mr. Richardson, you need to stay home today. Or you need to stay after school instead of going home today. If he gets physically close to me, gets up in my face and says that, I'm probably more likely to say okay, because it seems like he means business. The other thing is, if I trust him and he trusts me and I feel like he's a good boss, he's emotionally closer to me, and I like that, so I listen to him. The final two sources are the number of sources and the number of targets. The number of sources works this way. If there are more sources telling me to do something, I am more likely to do it. So let's say the principal comes up to me and says, hey, Nick, it would be a good idea if you stayed after school today to work on papers. And then another teacher comes up to me and says, hey, Mr. Richardson, it would be a good idea if you stayed after today and took some papers. And then let's say a couple students come up to me and say, hey, Mr. Richardson, did you finish grading our papers? Well, there's a lot of sources telling me that it would probably be a good idea to stay after school and grade papers. That's the number of sources. Finally, we have the number of targets. This one's a little bit harder to explain, and it does the opposite of what the other ones did. The first three increased the chance of me wanting to do something. The example I used was grading papers. The number of targets does the opposite. It decreases the chance of something happening. So if I'm in a room full of other teachers, and the principal comes in and says, hey, all of you, it would be a good idea for you all to stay home, to stay at school and grade some papers today. Because there's a lot of targets in that room, I may not feel like he's specifically talking to me. So because of that, I will be less inclined to stay home and to stay at school and grade papers. That demonstrates the number of targets decreasing the chance of something affecting me. Now, again, I'm sure you're asking, what does this have to do with Lord of the Flies? We are going to talk about that tomorrow, but it is important for you guys to have these concepts ready to go. Excited to see you guys tomorrow. Come in ready to learn, and we're going to learn a lot about psychology and a lot about Lord of the Flies. Have a good night.